Alright, we're going to go over this because the arguments presented are not very good in this video. Yes, last night I went over this video with my friend. I'm essentially going to go over most of the points I went over with him. I'm not going to do a typical reaction video because half of it's just going to be sitting and saying nothing. So I'm just going to go over the key points. So this is a very key point here. At the start of the video, he essentially says, well, no theist has ever presented evidence. Then he says, well, if you do have evidence, why don't you go to Norway, F off, and get a Nobel Peace Prize? So this was basically his argument. Once you get rid of all the, fancy text and whatnot. Theists have not provided any evidence for God's existence. Well, theist goes, well, I believe I have evidence. Well, go to Norway and get a Nobel Peace Prize and F off. Actually, let's play the clip.
It's a claim that has the burden of proof. But since theists haven't provided any such evidence for the existence of God, we won't be able to take use of this first method. Now, if you're sitting at home yelling at your computer and at the sound of my voice because you most definitely have good evidence for the existence of God, you shouldn't write it in the comment section of this video. No, you should finish up that scientific article of yours, publish it, and take a flight straight to Norway to receive your Nobel Peace Prize for finally revealing to humanity how the world actually works. Now, until that happens, we shall move on.
So this is basically what he just did. And there's a straw man put in here because if you look here, he basically paints the theist.
You shouldn't write
You're so mean.
it in the comment section of this.
No high-level theist says, well, because I speak to God, therefore he exists. No one ever makes that argument. So, it's a straw man, and also it doesn't make any sense. So, let's put ourselves in the Batman universe. I don't know why I made this example, but some guy goes like, well, there's no evidence Batman is Bruce Wayne. Then some other guy goes, well, oops. I believe I have evidence Batman is Bruce Wayne. Well, why don't you F off to Norway and go get a Nobel Peace Prize? It's just an appeal to ridicule. It's not a real argument, and combine that with the straw man, this undermines this entire video. Because he's essentially discounted all the evidence the other side has. Now, we're going to go over some other key points. Let's see. Okay. So, who created the creator? Let's first go. That's better. Okay, who created the creator? So, he actually, it's very interesting. So, first of all, the creator must be more complicated, right? Well, not really. Theists typically hold that God is a personal mind. That's a very simple thing. So, not really. Depends on what you mean by complicated. Anyways. Who created the creator? Now, his point was basically, well, the creator requires an explanation. And the response I originally had was, well, that would create an infinite regress. I mean, imagine if you need an explanation of any explanation. In order to say an explanation is the best explanation of a certain fact or situation, you don't need to have an explanation for the explanation, because then that would lead to an infinite regress. That's why you don't need it. But then later in the video, he admits that finding this explanation of the creator would lead to an infinite regress. So he basically admitted that his own argument was invalid. He basically did my job for me. He admitted to the infinite regress. So that's the reason why you don't need an explanation of the explanation. So that was pretty funny. The argument, if you watch the video, the argument's basically, many gods exist, therefore God does not exist. That's essentially what goes like, well, there's thousands of gods throughout history, they all can't be praying to the same God, blah, 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 societies, God, there's God here, there's God there, some of them are by God, some of them ancient, so therefore God doesn't exist. It's not really an argument, it's a non sequitur. Now, the other point, he goes, one God further. Now, one God further. Now, there's David Wood had a good responses, because this is the Michael Shermer, right? This is what I hear Michael Shermer say all the time. David Wood responded with this. He was on Podium. There was a podium here, and he goes, well, no, there's a lot of different views on how this podium got here. There's poly-podium builderism. There's podium builderism. One podium builder, polypodium builderism is multiple. Then, they're having this discussion, right? No, multiple people built this podium. No, only one person built this podium. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And then the atheist walks by and he's like, no one built the podium. So the point illustrated by that is to say there's a big difference from going from at least one to none. It's much bigger than going from poly to mono. Going from mono to none is a much bigger difference. So, I mean, I don't really think that's a valid argument. You can say that about anything, can you? Next, horrible elements religion entails. This is the point I came to the tail end of this video. The thing is, he can't even sustain his own claim here, because how is it horrible? By what standard is it horrible? Objectively horrible? Or do you just believe it's horrible subjectively? Is it a subjective or objective belief? Presumably, because he talks about logic so much in the video, I presume it's an objective belief. In that case, on what basis? On atheism, with no God not existing. What basis do you have for objective values? Not subjective. Well, I feel it's wrong. Not epistemological. I'm pretty sure I said that wrong. Who cares? I'm talking about ontologically. What basis is there, if not God? I'm not talking about which values, not that society. You can't use society, that's subjective. You can say, well, it came from evolution, that's subjective as well. Objective. It needs to be something above. So he can't even sustain his own claim that, well, it'll be better because we get rid of all the horrible elements religion entails. On what basis is it horrible? Next, prior probability. So at some point he was talking about miracles and said, well, what's more likely? A natural event occurred or a divine miracle happened? Now, there's some he didn't really go too far in depth with this, but it sounds kind of like a David Hume type of argument. Basically saying, well, a miracle can't happen. So my response, based on prior probability, I mean, what odds are there of it happening? My response is very simple. Is it possible that God exists? I think every person can at least say, well, I guess suppose it's possible. Okay. Therefore, miracles are, by extension, possible. So, it's no longer, well, it's impossible for a miracle to happen. Well, now it's possible, but it's extremely unlikely. Now this is where prior probability comes in. It says, well, essentially the argument's like this. I'll use an example. Let's say we live in a society where no one ever got murdered. And some guy gets murdered, and there's 1,000 witnesses. They go to the police forwards everything. There's a huge trial, all the people testify. And the judge is like, well, I have ruled. Not jury, judge, who cares? Let's not be technical about this. The judge rules. No one got murdered, because a murder has never occurred. Ever. There's prior probability, right? It's never occurred before, so it can't happen, right? And then everyone goes like, well, what about all the testimony? What about all the evidence? Like, well, no, it's never happened before. Prior probability. And as far as miracle goes, and this is what they do with Jesus' resurrection, how a man can't raise from the dead. That's essentially what they say, and that's based on prior probability. You completely discount all of the evidence. When you base things solely off prior probability, you get ridiculous situations where no amount of evidence can convince someone of an event occurring, when you just base it on prior probability. This would go for any other event. If there's an event that has never occurred in this universe, then technically, under prior probability, it's not possible, because it's never happened before. So that's quite... It's funny to think about, really. David Hume's argument has been kicked to the curb by all atheists I've ever seen. The only atheist I really see that holds this position is this guy and Bart Ehrman. But Bart Ehrman's just a historian. Anyways, that's my response to this video. I've heard much better arguments elsewhere. This guy's like a combination of Richard Dawkins and Michael Shermer. And it's funny to think about because both of those guys are some of the worst atheist debaters I've ever seen.